August 7, 1943. 20,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. The tropical sun glints off the twin booms of a Lockheed P-38 Lightning as it slices through the Pacific sky. In the cockpit, Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson scans the horizon, his hands steady on the control yoke. Below him, scattered clouds drift over an endless expanse of turquoise ocean. Then he sees them. 6 dots climbing from the southeast. Japanese zeros. Johnson's pulse quickens, but he's confident. He's flying America's most advanced fighter, a plane with 2 engines, devastating firepower, and a top speed of over 400 miles per hour. The P-38 Lightning is supposed to be unstoppable. He pushes the throttles forward, diving toward the enemy formation. The twin Allison engines roar. His airspeed climbs, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. He's locked onto the trailing zero. His finger moves to the trigger, and then everything goes wrong. The zero breaks left, an impossibly tight turn. Johnson follows, pulling back on the yoke. He needs to stay on target for just 3 more seconds. But as the G-forces build, as his Lightning pulls harder into the turn, something terrifying happens. The aircraft shudders. The tail buffets violently. And suddenly, without warning, the left wing snaps down. The P-38 rolls inverted and tumbles into a spin. Johnson fights the controls. 4,000 feet of altitude gone. 3,000. He's spinning toward the ocean, and nothing he does makes any difference. The mighty Lightning, America's hope in the Pacific, has just tried to kill him. At 1,500 feet, the spin finally stops. Johnson pulls out, his hands shaking, his flight suit soaked with sweat. Above him, the zeros circle lazily, as if mocking him. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was happening to P-38 pilots across the Pacific theater. And it was threatening to lose America the air war. But within weeks, everything would change. Because of one man. One simple idea. And one piece of wire that his fellow mechanics called the stupidest thing they'd ever seen. This is that story. To understand how we got here, we need to go back 6 years. Back to 1937, when the world was very different. Europe was rearming. Germany's Luftwaffe was growing. Japan was expanding across Asia. And the United States Army Air Corps, not yet the Air Force, still part of the Army, realized it had a problem. American fighters were obsolete. The best American fighter in 1937 was the Boeing P-26 Peashooter. It was a cute little plane, a monoplane with fixed landing gear and an open cockpit. It looked like something a barnstormer would fly. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. Because while the P-26 could reach 200 miles per hour, the Germans were already testing fighters that could reach 350. America was falling behind. In February 1937, the Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X-608. It was a specification for a new interceptor fighter. The requirements were aggressive, almost fantastical. The new fighter had to reach 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. It had to achieve a top speed of at least 360 miles per hour. It had to have excellent high-altitude performance. And it had to have enough firepower to destroy enemy bombers with a single burst. Aircraft companies across America read these specifications and scratched their heads. It was impossible. You couldn't build a single-engine fighter that could do all of these things. The technology simply didn't exist yet. Most companies didn't even bother submitting a proposal. But Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, a relatively small company in Burbank, California, saw an opportunity. Lockheed had a secret weapon, a 28-year-old engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson. Johnson had already proven himself brilliant, having designed the Lockheed Electra, a commercial transport that Amelia Earhart had flown on her attempted around-the-world flight. Kelly Johnson was one of those rare engineers who could see solutions that others missed. When Johnson read Circular Proposal X608, he had a radical thought. What if we stopped trying to make one engine do all the work? What if we used two engines instead? It was heresy. Fighters were supposed to be single-engine aircraft. That was the conventional wisdom. Twin-engine planes were bombers, transports, heavy fighters, not nimble interceptors. Two engines meant more weight, more drag, more complexity. But Johnson saw the advantages. Two engines meant twice the power. Two engines meant you could reach that 20,000-foot altitude requirement easily. Two engines meant that if one failed, you could still make it home. And if you were clever about the design, you could minimize the drag penalty. Johnson's design was unlike anything anyone had seen before. Instead of mounting the engines in the wings, traditional style, he mounted them in long booms that extended backward from the wings. The pilot would sit in a central nacelle, a gondola, really, right in the middle. The tail would connect the two booms together. It looked strange. It looked futuristic. It looked like something from a Flash Gordon serial. His colleagues at Lockheed thought he was crazy. His boss, Hall Hibbard, looked at the drawings and said, "Kelly, this is the weirdest damn airplane I've ever seen. But I'll be damned if it might not work." They submitted the proposal. And in June 1937, the Army Air Corps selected Lockheed's design. The contract was for one experimental prototype, designated XP-38. Now Johnson had to actually build it. The XP-38 took shape in Lockheed's Burbank facility over the next 18 months. Every aspect of it was cutting edge. The engines were supercharged Allison V1710s, each producing over 1,000 horsepower. The propellers rotated in opposite directions, one clockwise, one counterclockwise, to cancel out the torque effects that plagued other twin-engine aircraft. The landing gear retracted into the engine nacelles. The cockpit was pressurized and heated, a first for a fighter. And the armament was devastating. 4 Browning 50 caliber machine guns clustered in the nose, along with a single Hispano 20mm cannon, unlike every other fighter in existence, which had guns mounted in the wings that converged at a specific distance. All of the P-38's guns pointed straight ahead. There was no convergence to worry about. Every bullet, every cannon shell, went exactly where the pilot aimed. It was like giving a pilot a laser pointer attached to a machine gun. On January 27, 1939, test pilot Lieutenant Ben Kelsey climbed into the XP-38 for its maiden flight. He later recalled, "I remember thinking, this thing looks like it was designed by a science fiction writer. 2 tails. 2 engines. It looked fast just sitting on the ground." Kelsey took off. The XP-38 leaped into the air. Within minutes, he was doing aerobatics, testing the controls, pushing the aircraft through its paces. When he landed, he was grinning from ear to ear. "It flies like a dream," he reported. "This thing is going to change everything." He was right. But not in the way anyone expected. The Army Air Corps was thrilled with the test results. They immediately ordered 13 pre-production models, designated YP-38. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and World War II began in Europe, the P-38 was already in limited production. American newspapers wrote breathless articles about the fork-tailed devil, as it would later be nicknamed. Aviation magazines published cutaway drawings. Young men who would soon become pilots looked at photographs of the P-38 and dreamed of flying it. It looked like the future. It looked invincible, but looks can be deceiving. The first hint that something was wrong came in 1941, during test flights in California. A Lockheed test pilot named Ralph Verdon took a P-38E up to high altitude to test its dive performance. This was standard procedure. Every fighter needed to be able to dive on enemy aircraft. Verdon climbed to 30,000 feet. He rolled inverted. He pulled through, pointing the nose straight down. The P-38 accelerated rapidly. 300 miles per hour. 400. 450. 500. And then the nose tucked down even further. Verdon pulled back on the yoke, but the controls didn't respond. The stick felt like it was locked in concrete. The plane was in what pilots call a graveyard spiral, a dive that keeps getting steeper no matter what you do. Ralph Verdon never pulled out. The P-38 impacted the ground at over 500 miles per hour. The investigation revealed something that terrified Lockheed's engineers. At high speeds, the air flowing over the P-38's wings was reaching supersonic velocities, even though the plane itself was still subsonic. This created shock waves on the wings. These shock waves disrupted the airflow over the tail, making the elevators useless. It was called compressibility tuck. And in 1941, nobody really understood it. The science of supersonic aerodynamics was still in its infancy. Wind tunnels couldn't replicate these conditions. Engineers could calculate what was happening, but they couldn't test solutions. Lockheed tried various fixes. They added dive brakes under the wings, essentially small flaps that would create drag and slow the aircraft down. This helped, but it didn't completely solve the problem. Pilots were warned, don't dive too steeply. Don't exceed certain speeds. Be careful. But there was another problem with the P-38. A problem that was even more dangerous because it was less predictable. It showed up not in dives but in turns. When test pilots performed maximum performance turns, the kind you'd make in combat, trying to get your guns on an enemy aircraft, something strange would happen. The airplane would shake. The tail would buffet. And then, suddenly, with no warning, one wing would snap down and the aircraft would roll inverted. Sometimes pilots could recover. Sometimes they couldn't. Lockheed engineers called it tail flutter. Pilots had other names for it, most of them unprintable. Here's what was happening, though nobody fully understood it at the time. The P-38's ailerons, the control surfaces on the wings that made the plane roll, were enormous. They had to be, because the aircraft was so large and heavy. When a pilot turned the control wheel to initiate a roll, these massive ailerons moved against tremendous air pressure. At high speeds and high G-loads, exactly the conditions you'd encounter in combat, something called aileron reversal would occur. The pilot would turn the wheel left, trying to roll left. The left aileron would go up and the right aileron would go down, as designed. But the aerodynamic forces on these massive control surfaces were so strong that they would actually twist the entire wing. The wing would twist so much that it would counteract what the ailerons were trying to do. In extreme cases, the plane would actually roll in the opposite direction from the pilot's input. And the twisting forces would transmit through the airframe to the tail, causing it to flutter and buffet. This was cutting-edge aerodynamics, the kind of thing that wouldn't be fully understood for another decade. In 1941, Lockheed's engineers knew something was wrong, but they couldn't quite figure out what. They tried reinforcing the wings. They tried strengthening the tail. They tried different aileron designs. Nothing seemed to work completely. And then, in December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America was at war. And there was no more time for testing. The P-38s rolling off Lockheed's production lines were needed immediately. They would be sent to the Pacific Theater, where they would face the most maneuverable fighter aircraft ever built. The Mitsubishi A6M0. Let me tell you about the Zero. Because to understand why the P-38's problems were so deadly, you need to understand what American pilots were up against. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was, in 1942, the best carrier-based fighter in the world. It wasn't the fastest, American fighters could outrun it. It wasn't the most heavily armed, it carried only two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns. And it certainly wasn't the most durable. The Zero had almost no armor protection and no self-sealing fuel tanks. But it could turn. Oh, how it could turn! A Zero could complete a full 360-degree turn in just under 15 seconds. That might not sound impressive until you realize that most American fighters took 25 to 30 seconds to do the same thing. In a dogfight, that difference was the difference between life and death. The Zero could turn so tightly because it was built like a glider. The entire aircraft weighed only 6,000 pounds fully loaded, about the same as a modern Toyota Camry. For comparison, a P-38 weighed 15,000 pounds. The Zero's wings were long and light, optimized for maneuverability rather than speed or durability. Japanese pilots trained extensively in aerobatics and close-in fighting. Their tactics were based on getting into turning engagements where the Zero's maneuverability would dominate. When the first P-38s arrived in the Pacific in late 1942, American pilots were confident. They'd been told they were flying the best fighter in the world. They had 2 engines, superior speed, better firepower, and more armor. On paper, the Lightning should have swept the Zeros from the sky. The reality was different. Captain Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron later described his first encounter with Zeros. "We spotted them below us, maybe 6 or 8 Zeros escorting bombers. Perfect setup, right? We had altitude, we had speed. We dove on them, textbook bounce. I got my sights on 1 Zero and fired. Saw hits. But I didn't have enough closure, so I followed him." This was Lynch's first mistake. Every American pilot was taught, make 1 pass, then use your speed to zoom back to altitude. Never follow a Japanese fighter into a turning fight. But combat isn't a classroom. Lynch's target broke hard left, and instinctively, Lynch followed, pulling back on his yoke to stay with the Zero. "That's when it happened," Lynch recalled. "I was maybe 3 seconds into the turn when the whole plane started shaking. It felt like the tail was going to rip off. Then the left wing just snapped down, and suddenly I'm inverted, spinning, and this Zero I was chasing is now behind me, shooting." Lynch managed to recover using the one advantage the P-38 had, power. He shoved the throttles forward and dove away, using his speed to escape. But the lesson was learned. You couldn't turn with a Zero in a P-38. You just couldn't. Except the problem was, you couldn't always avoid it. Combat is chaotic. You don't always have altitude to dive from. You don't always have room to run. Sometimes you're forced into a turning fight whether you want one or not. And when that happened, P-38 pilots were in trouble. By early 1943, the P-38's reputation was suffering. Pilots called it the Widowmaker. Some refused to fly it. Squadron commanders requested different aircraft, anything but the Lightning. The Navy pilots, flying F-4F Wildcats and the newer F-6F Hellcats, looked at the P-38 with disdain. Twin-engine coffin, they called it. This wasn't just bad for morale. It was a strategic problem. The Army Air Forces had invested millions of dollars in the P-38. Lockheed was producing them as fast as possible, over 400 aircraft per month by mid-1943. The entire American strategy in the Pacific depended on gaining air superiority. And the plane that was supposed to win that superiority was failing. Lockheed engineers back in Burbank were working on solutions. They were designing dive recovery flaps, small surfaces under the wings that would help pilots pull out of high-speed dives. They were strengthening the tail structure. They were modifying the aileron control mechanisms. But all of these changes took time. They had to be designed, tested, approved, incorporated into production, and then retrofitted to aircraft already in the field. The process would take months, maybe years. The pilots in the Pacific didn't have months. They needed a solution now. And that's when Charles Lindbergh showed up. Charles Augustus Lindbergh. The name was famous around the world. In 1927, at age 25, he had made the first solo nonstop flight across the Atlantic Ocean, flying from New York to Paris in a tiny single-engine monoplane called the Spirit of St. Louis. Overnight, he became the most famous man in the world. Lucky Lindy, the newspapers called him. The Lone Eagle. But by 1943, Charles Lindbergh was a controversial figure in America. Before the war, Lindbergh had been an outspoken isolationist. He gave speeches arguing that America should stay out of the war in Europe. He visited Germany and was impressed by the Luftwaffe. He accepted a medal from Hermann Göring. His critics accused him of being a Nazi sympathizer. His supporters said he was just being realistic about America's readiness for war. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Lindbergh tried to rejoin the military. He'd been a colonel in the Army Air Corps Reserve. But President Roosevelt, who despised Lindbergh, made sure his application was denied. Lindbergh was frozen out of military service. So he did the next best thing. He became a civilian consultant. United Aircraft Corporation hired him as a technical representative. His job, officially, was to help the company improve its engines and maximize their efficiency. But Lindbergh had other ideas. He wanted to help the war effort in any way he could. And that meant going to where the fighting was. In June 1943, Lindbergh arrived in the South Pacific. He was 41 years old, balding, with the lean, weathered look of a man who'd spent his life in cockpits. He wore civilian clothes, khaki shirts, work pants, but everyone knew who he was. The combat pilots didn't know what to make of him. On one hand, he was Charles Lindbergh, a living legend. On the other hand, he was a civilian, a desk guy, someone who hadn't flown combat. What could he teach them? That attitude changed quickly. Lindbergh had more flying hours than most of the squadron commanders. He'd been flying experimental aircraft for 15 years. And he wasn't content to just observe. Within days of arriving at WWII airfield in New Guinea, he asked permission to fly a combat mission. Technically, this was completely against regulations. Civilians weren't allowed to fly combat. If Lindbergh was shot down and captured, it would be a propaganda disaster. The base commander, Colonel Charles MacDonald, should have said no. Instead, he looked at Lindbergh and said, "If you happen to be in the cockpit when we take off tomorrow morning, and if you happen to still be there when we cross into enemy territory, I suppose there's not much I can do about it." The next morning, Lindbergh climbed into a P-38. It was the first time he'd flown one. He took off with the squadron, and they headed north toward Japanese-held territory. What happened next became the stuff of legend. During the mission, the squadron encountered Japanese fighters. Lindbergh, who was supposed to just observe, found himself in a dogfight. He shot down a Japanese aircraft, a Mitsubishi bomber, making him one of the few civilians in history to score an aerial kill. But more importantly, he experienced firsthand what the pilots had been talking about. He tried to turn with an enemy fighter, and he felt the P-38 shudder and shake. He felt the wings start to drop. And he understood, immediately, that this wasn't just a pilot's skill issue. There was something fundamentally wrong with the aircraft. When they landed back at WWII, Lindbergh started asking questions. He talked to the pilots. What exactly happens when you turn? When does the shaking start? Can you predict it? Can you recover from it? He talked to the mechanics. How are the controls rigged? What's the standard procedure? Have you noticed any patterns? He studied the maintenance manuals. He looked at the technical drawings of the aileron control system. He sat in the cockpit and moved the control wheel, watching how the cables and pulleys transmitted force to the ailerons themselves. And slowly, an idea began to form. The P-38's aileron control system was, like everything else on the aircraft, state-of-the-art for its time. When the pilot turned the control wheel, cables running through the wings would pull on the ailerons, making them move. It was a purely mechanical system, no hydraulics, no power assist, just cables and pulleys. The ailerons themselves were massive, each one was about 8 feet long and 2 feet wide. They had to be large because the P-38 was such a big, heavy aircraft. Moving these ailerons against the air pressure at high speed required significant force. Pilots complained that the controls felt heavy, sluggish. Here's what Lindbergh noticed. When you turned the control wheel to roll left, the left aileron was supposed to go up and the right aileron was supposed to go down, and they were supposed to move equal amounts. That's how ailerons work on every aircraft. But on the P-38, they didn't move equal amounts. The aileron going down, the one with air pressure pushing against its bottom surface, would actually deflect farther than the aileron going up. This was because the aerodynamic forces were so strong that they were physically pushing the aileron down more than the cable system was pulling it. This created an asymmetry. An asymmetry in aerodynamics is always bad. What happened was this: the pilot would turn the wheel to roll left. The right aileron would go down too far, creating massive lift on the right wing. This lift would twist the entire wing upward. The wing would flex, not much, maybe only an inch or two at the tip, but enough. This flex would change the angle of attack of the wing. It would also transmit twisting forces through the airframe to the tail. The tail, meanwhile, was already dealing with tremendous aerodynamic loads from the high-speed airflow. When these additional twisting forces arrived from the wings, the tail would start to flutter, actually vibrating at high frequency. This flutter would feed back into the wings, creating more twisting, which would create more flutter. It was a feedback loop. And once it started, it would rapidly escalate until either the pilot backed off on the controls, or the wing would stall, or the aircraft would enter a snap roll. Lindbergh understood that Lockheed's engineers were working on long-term solutions, stronger tail structures, redesigned ailerons, maybe even powered controls. But those solutions were months away. What if there was a simpler fix? What if you just didn't let the ailerons deflect so far? It was a radical idea. Aviation engineers spent years calculating exactly how much control surface deflection was needed for adequate maneuverability. You couldn't just arbitrarily limit the controls. That's not how it worked. Except, Lindbergh thought, maybe it was exactly how it worked. He walked over to a tool bench at WWII airfield. He found a spool of safety wire, the kind mechanics used to secure bolts and fasteners, preventing them from vibrating loose. It was just steel wire, maybe 1/16 of an inch in diameter. He walked over to a P-38 that was undergoing maintenance. He asked the crew chief if he could look at the aileron control system. The crew chief, recognizing Lindbergh, said of course. Lindbergh crawled under the wing. He found where the control cables attached to the aileron control horns. And he did something incredibly simple. He took the safety wire and wrapped it around the control horn and the wing structure, creating a physical stop that would prevent the aileron from deflecting downward more than about 10 degrees. That was it. Just a piece of wire, twisted tight. He did the same thing on the other wing, making sure both ailerons were limited equally. The whole modification took maybe 20 minutes. When he crawled out from under the wing, the mechanics were staring at him. "Mr. Lindbergh," one of them said carefully, "you just disabled half the aileron travel." "I know," Lindbergh said. That's not how you fix airplanes." "Maybe not," Lindbergh replied. "But let's see if it works." The base commander heard about what Lindbergh had done. He came over to look at the modification. He looked at Lindbergh. He looked at the wire. He looked back at Lindbergh. "You want to test fly this?" "Yes." "You know this isn't approved by anyone. Not Lockheed, not the Army, not anyone." "I know." The commander thought about it. Finally, he shrugged. "Well, if Charles Lindbergh wants to kill himself testing a stupid wire trick, I guess that's his business. You're cleared to fly." June 28, 1943. Early morning at WWII. The tropical sun was just rising over the Owen Stanley Mountains. Charles Lindbergh performed his pre-flight inspection on the modified P-38, checking everything twice. A crowd had gathered. Pilots, mechanics, ground crew, everyone wanted to see what would happen. Some were curious. Some were skeptical. Some thought Lindbergh was about to crash. Lindbergh climbed into the cockpit. The twin Allison engines coughed to life, then settled into a smooth rumble. He taxied to the runway, ran through his checklist, and advanced the throttles. The P-38 accelerated down the pierced steel plank runway and lifted into the air. Lindbergh climbed to 10,000 feet and leveled off. Now for the test. He took a deep breath. He banked the aircraft into a gentle turn, getting a feel for the controls. Yes, the ailerons felt different. They felt limited. He needed to use more rudder to coordinate the turn. But the aircraft was stable. He tightened the turn, pulling more G-forces. 2 gs. 3 gs. The P-38 carved through the sky. The wings flexed slightly. That was normal. But there was no shuddering. No buffeting. No flutter. He rolled out and tried the other direction. Same result. The aircraft handled beautifully. Now for the real test. Lindbergh pulled up into a climb, gaining altitude. At 15,000 feet, he rolled inverted, pulled through, and entered a steep dive. He let the speed build. 400 miles per hour. 450. 500. Then he hauled back on the yoke, pulling into a maximum performance turn at high speed, exactly the kind of maneuver that had been killing pilots. The G-forces slammed him back into his seat. 4 gs. 5 gs. The blood drained from his head. Gray spots appeared in his vision. But the aircraft stayed stable. The controls remained responsive. There was no flutter, no snap roll, no wing drop. Lindbergh held the turn, carving a tight circle in the sky at 500 miles per hour and 5 gs of force. It was the kind of turn you'd need in combat. The kind of turn that could keep you alive. He rolled out, reduced power, and headed back to base. When he landed, the crowd was waiting. "Well?" the base commander asked. Lindbergh pulled off his flight helmet. He was smiling, a rare expression for the usually serious aviator. "It works," he said simply. "The aircraft is completely stable in high G turns. No flutter. No control reversal. It's like flying a different airplane." "But what about the limited aileron authority?" one of the pilots asked. "Can you still maneuver effectively?" "You have to use more rudder," Lindbergh explained. "The ailerons alone won't roll the aircraft as quickly as before. But if you coordinate with rudder, the roll rate is almost as good. And more importantly, the aircraft is predictable. It does what you tell it to do." The pilots looked at each other. This was huge. If Lindbergh was right, this simple modification could solve the P-38's biggest problem. But there was skepticism too. One modification, one test flight, that wasn't enough data. What if it worked for Lindbergh but not for other pilots? What if there were side effects? What if it only worked in certain conditions? A young lieutenant named James Griffin spoke up. "Mr. Lindbergh, with respect, you're one of the best pilots in the world. Maybe you can make it work because of your skill. But what about us? What about average pilots?" It was a fair question. Lindbergh nodded. "Let's find out. Who wants to try it?" Griffin volunteered. He'd been one of the pilots most vocal about the P-38's handling problems. He climbed into the modified aircraft and took off. 15 minutes later, he was back on the ground, and he was grinning from ear to ear. "Holy hell," he said. "That's not the same airplane. I pulled 7 gs in a turn, and it didn't even hiccup. This changes everything." Word spread like wildfire. Within hours, every mechanic on the base was modifying P-38s using Lindbergh's wire trick. They didn't wait for official approval. They didn't ask permission from Lockheed or the Army. They just did it. By the next day, every P-38 at WWII had been modified. And the pilots couldn't wait to try it in combat. July 2, 1943. 4 days after Lindbergh's test flight. A flight of 8 P-38s from the 39th Fighter Squadron was on patrol over the Huon Gulf when they spotted a formation of Japanese aircraft, 6 Zeros escorting a group of bombers. Lieutenant James Griffin was leading the flight. His P-38 had Lindbergh's modification. So did the other 7 aircraft in his formation. Griffin keyed his radio. "Okay, boys, we've got the altitude advantage. Let's go get 'em. And remember, we can turn now. Don't be afraid to use it." They dove on the Japanese formation. Griffin lined up on a zero and opened fire. The Japanese pilot saw him coming and broke hard left, expecting the P-38 to sail past, unable to follow. But Griffin stayed with him. He turned the control wheel, coordinated with rudder, and the P-38 carved into the turn. The Zero tightened his turn, pulling as hard as he could. Griffin pulled harder. His vision grayed out from the G-forces, but the aircraft stayed stable, the controls remained responsive. He was actually turning with a zero. And keeping up. The Japanese pilot must have been shocked. He tried everything: barrel rolls, vertical reversals, scissors maneuvers. But Griffin stayed on him, using the P-38's superior power to maintain position. When the range closed to 200 yards, Griffin squeezed the trigger. The 450 caliber machine guns and the 20 mm cannon roared. The Zero disintegrated in a ball of fire. Around him, Griffin's squadron mates were having similar success. The P-38s were turning with the Zeros, something the Japanese pilots had never experienced before. The battle turned into a rout. By the time it was over, the Americans had shot down 5 Zeros and 2 bombers. None of the P-38s were damaged. When they landed back at base, the intelligence officers couldn't believe the combat reports. P-38s were turning with Zeros? That wasn't possible. But it had happened. And it kept happening. Over the next few weeks, as more P-38s were modified with Lindbergh's wire trick, the combat results improved dramatically. Pilots who had been afraid of the P-38 now requested it. Kill ratios improved. Loss rates dropped. The modification spread from base to base across the Pacific theater. Mechanics shared the technique with each other. Lindbergh's wire trick, they called it. Or sometimes just the wire mod. Some called it the stupid wire fix, said with affection rather than derision. Official channels were slower. When reports of the modification reached Lockheed headquarters in Burbank, the engineers were skeptical. This wasn't proper engineering. You couldn't just tie wires around control systems. It wasn't tested. It wasn't approved. It wasn't in any manual. But then the combat results kept coming in. And the data was undeniable. P-38s with the modification were outperforming stock P-38s by a significant margin. Pilots with the modification were winning engagements they would have lost before. Lockheed's chief engineer, Clarence Kelly Johnson, studied the reports. He ran the numbers. He did wind tunnel tests. And finally, he had to admit, Lindbergh was right. By limiting the aileron deflection, you prevented the wing twisting that caused the tail flutter. It was elegant. It was simple. And it worked. In August 1943, Lockheed issued a technical order officially incorporating a version of Lindbergh's modification. They used adjustable stops rather than safety wire, and they specified exact deflection angles, but the principle was the same. The modification was now official. But by that point, field mechanics had already modified most of the P-38s in the Pacific Theater. They'd been doing it for weeks, using nothing but safety wire and common sense. By late 1943, the P-38 Lightning was becoming the dominant fighter in the Pacific theater. And two pilots in particular were proving just how effective the modified Lightning could be. Major Richard Ira, Dick Bond was a farm kid from Wisconsin who'd learned to fly in the Army Air Corps. He wasn't a natural pilot. His instructors had described him as adequate but not exceptional. But he had one quality that made him deadly. He was calm under pressure. Bond flew a P-38 with Lindbergh's modification installed. He named his aircraft. Bond flew a P-38 with Lindbergh's modification installed. He named his aircraft Marge, after his girlfriend back home, Marjorie Vitendel. And he started racking up kills at an astonishing rate. Bond's tactics were textbook. He used the P-38's speed and altitude advantage to position himself above enemy formations. He'd dive, make one pass with his devastating nose-mounted guns, then zoom back to altitude. But when he needed to, when the situation demanded it, he could now turn with Japanese fighters. Not outturn them, but turn well enough to bring his guns to bear. His 21st kill came on October 29, 1943, over Rabaul. He dove on a formation of zeros, shot down the leader, then found himself in a turning fight with two more. The old P-38 would have been helpless. But Bond's modified Lightning stayed with them through 3 full turns before he got firing position and shot them both down. 3 kills in one mission. By December 1943, Bond had 28 confirmed kills, making him the top American ace in the Pacific. By the end of the war, he would have 40 confirmed kills, more than any other American pilot in history. And he credited the modified P-38 with saving his life dozens of times. Then there was Major Thomas Buchanan, Tommy McGuire Jr. from New Jersey. If Bond was calm and methodical, McGuire was aggressive and competitive. He wanted to be the top ace. He wanted to beat Bond's record. And he flew his P-38, which he named Pudgy, with an almost reckless intensity. McGuire's tactics were different from Bond's. He would get in close, sometimes within 50 yards, before opening fire. He wanted to be absolutely sure of his kills. This aggressive style meant he often found himself in turning fights, exactly the situation that had been so dangerous before the modification. On December 26, 1943, McGuire was on patrol over New Britain when his 4-plane flight encountered 15 Japanese fighters. The smart move would have been to run. They were outnumbered almost 4-1. But McGuire wasn't known for making the smart move. He was known for making the bold move. "Let's take him," he called over the radio. What followed was one of the most intense dogfights of the Pacific War. For 15 minutes, 4 P-38s fought 15 Japanese aircraft in a swirling, turning melee. McGuire shot down 3 Zeros, using the P-38's improved turning capability to stay in the fight. His wingmen got 2 more. The Japanese broke off and retreated. 5 kills against 15 attackers, with no American losses. It was the kind of victory that would have been impossible a year earlier. By January 1945, McGuire had 38 confirmed kills, just 2 behind Bond. But tragically, McGuire's aggressiveness finally caught up with him. On January 7, 1945, while flying a P-38 that was carrying extra fuel tanks, which made it heavier and less maneuverable, he got into a low-altitude turning fight with a Japanese fighter. He pulled too hard, the P-38 stalled, and he crashed into the jungle. He was just 24 years old. Both Bond and McGuire received the Medal of Honor. Both became legends. And both had flown P-38s modified with what started as a simple piece of safety wire. But they weren't the only ones. Dozens of other aces flew modified P-38s. Charles MacDonald, who ended the war with 27 kills. Thomas Lynch, who had 20. Gerald Johnson with 22. All of them flew Lightnings. All of them benefited from Lindbergh's modification. The P-38 became the fighter that shot down more Japanese aircraft than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific theater. It flew the longest fighter mission of the war, a 2,000-mile round trip to intercept and kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. It served as a fighter bomber, reconnaissance aircraft, and night fighter. And it all started to come together when someone thought to try something stupid. While Lindbergh's wire trick solved the immediate problem, Lockheed's engineers continued working on more permanent solutions. The wire modification was brilliant in its simplicity, but it was still a field expedient, a temporary fix that addressed the symptom rather than the cause. By late 1943, Lockheed had developed what they called the dive recovery flap system. These were electrically actuated flaps mounted under the wings, just outboard of the engines. When a pilot found himself in a high-speed dive and couldn't pull out, he could deploy these flaps. They would create drag and disrupt the airflow in just the right way to restore elevator effectiveness. The dive flaps were incorporated into the P-38J model, which began production in August 1943. They worked. Pilots could now recover from dives that would have been fatal before. But the modification added weight and complexity, and some pilots never trusted them. Old habits die hard, and many pilots simply avoided getting into situations where they need the dive flaps. Lockheed also strengthened the tail structure on later models. They added more ribbing, stronger spars, and better bracing. This reduced the tendency toward flutter, though it didn't eliminate it entirely. The fundamental problem, the wing twisting caused by aileron deflection, was still there. The real solution came with the P-38L model, the last and most produced variant. On the P-38L, Lockheed finally addressed the aileron issue properly. They redesigned the aileron control system to include hydraulically boosted controls. This meant the pilot's input was augmented by hydraulic actuators, which could overpower the aerodynamic forces trying to push the ailerons to extreme deflections. The hydraulically boosted ailerons maintained proper symmetry even at high speeds and high G loads. The wings didn't twist. The tail didn't flutter. The P-38L could turn as hard as any pilot dared without the aircraft fighting back. But here's the thing, the P-38L didn't enter service until June 1944. That was a full year after Lindbergh's modification. For that entire year, a crucial year in the Pacific War, it was the field-modified aircraft with their safety wire stops that won the air battles. By the time the P-38L arrived with its proper engineering solution, the war had already turned. American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific. The Japanese were on the defensive. Air superiority had been won. And much of that victory was due to pilots flying P-38s modified with pieces of wire. Charles Lindbergh spent 6 months in the Pacific Theater in 1944. During that time, he flew 50 combat missions, all of them technically illegal, since he was a civilian. He shot down 1 confirmed Japanese aircraft, and possibly a second. But his real contribution wasn't his combat record. It was his work improving the P-38's operational efficiency. Lindbergh was obsessed with fuel economy. He'd flown across the Atlantic on a shoestring fuel budget, and he understood how to maximize range. He taught P-38 pilots how to cruise climb, a technique where you climbed slowly while cruising, maintaining optimal fuel efficiency. He showed them how to lean out their fuel mixtures, how to synchronize their propellers, how to use every drop of fuel effectively. Using Lindbergh's techniques, P-38 pilots extended their combat radius by hundreds of miles. Missions that were thought impossible became routine. The long-range fighter escort missions that won the air war over Japan were made possible, in part, by Lindbergh's fuel management techniques. He never sought credit for any of it. In his official reports, he simply noted observations and suggestions. The wire modification was described as a field expedient that appears to improve handling characteristics under certain conditions. No drama. No self-aggrandizement. After the war, Lindbergh rarely spoke about his Pacific service. He wrote a book called The Wartime Journals of Charles A. Lindbergh, published in 1970, which detailed his experiences. But even there, he downplayed his contributions. The wire modification gets maybe 3 paragraphs. Other people remembered, though. Dick Bond mentioned Lindbergh in his memoirs. Tommy McGuire, before his death, told reporters that Lindbergh's mods saved a lot of lives. P-38 pilots who'd been there passed the story down to younger pilots. But somehow, the story never made it into the official histories. When you read about the P-38 Lightning today, you'll learn about its twin-boom design, its heavy armament, its role in killing Yamamoto. You might read about the dive recovery flaps and the hydraulically boosted controls. But you probably won't read about the safety wire. You probably won't read about a hot June day in New Guinea when a 41-year-old civilian crawled under a wing with a spool of wire and changed the course of the air war. History sometimes forgets the small moments. The unglamorous solutions. The stupid tricks that turn out to be brilliant. There's an important lesson in this story, and it's not just about aviation. It's about how we solve problems. When the P-38's handling problems first appeared, Lockheed's response was entirely reasonable. They assembled their best engineers. They did calculations. They ran wind tunnel tests. They designed proper engineering solutions that would address the root causes of the problem. This is how engineering is supposed to work. You don't slap band-aids on problems. You understand them deeply, then fix them properly. But proper engineering takes time. And sometimes you don't have time. Lindbergh's approach was different. He wasn't trying to design the perfect solution. He was trying to find a solution that worked right now, with the tools and materials at hand. He looked at the problem and asked, what's the simplest thing we could try? Limit the aileron deflection. Use a piece of wire. See what happens. It was inelegant. It was crude. It violated every principle of proper engineering. And it worked. There's a term in engineering. Satisficing. It means finding a solution that's good enough, rather than waiting for the perfect solution. Lindbergh's wire trick was the ultimate example of satisficing. The professional engineers at Lockheed eventually developed better solutions. The hydraulically boosted controls on the P-38L were superior to the wire modification in every way. But they came too late for hundreds of pilots who would have benefited from them. Sometimes, good enough right now is better than perfect later. This tension between quick fixes and proper solutions exists in every field. In software development, they call it technical debt, taking shortcuts now that you'll have to fix later. In medicine, they call it stabilize first, diagnose later. In business, they call it minimum viable product. The wisdom is knowing when to use which approach. And the courage is being willing to try something stupid when the proper solution is too far away. So why isn't Charles Lindbergh better known for this contribution? Why isn't the wire trick taught in engineering schools as an example of creative problem solving? Part of it is that Lindbergh himself didn't promote the story. He was a private man, especially after the kidnapping and murder of his infant son in 1932 had made his family the subject of horrible media attention. By 1943, Lindbergh had learned to avoid the spotlight. Part of it is that the modification was so simple that it didn't seem noteworthy. A piece of wire? That's not innovation. That's not engineering. That's just a trick. A field expedient. Not the stuff of history books. Part of it is that Lindbergh remained a controversial figure. His pre-war isolationism, his acceptance of a German medal, his statements that were seen as sympathetic to the Nazis, all of this colored his legacy. After the war, many Americans didn't want to celebrate Charles Lindbergh. They wanted to forget him. And part of it is just the nature of how history gets written. The big moments get remembered. The dramatic battles. The technological breakthroughs. The moments when everything changed. But history is also made of small moments. A mechanic adjusting a control cable. A pilot trying a new technique. An engineer asking, "What if we tried this?" The P-38 Lightning flew 130,000 combat sorties during World War II. It destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific. It flew some of the longest, most dangerous missions of the war. And for a crucial year, maybe the most important year of the Pacific Air War, a significant number of those P-38s were held together, in part, by pieces of safety wire twisted around their aileron controls. Those pieces of wire saved lives. They won battles. They changed the outcome of the war. And they started with one man looking at a problem differently. One man willing to try something stupid. One man who understood that perfect is the enemy of good enough. Today, you can see P-38 Lightnings in museums around the world. The Smithsonian has one. The Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson has several. There are a handful still flying, restored and maintained by dedicated collectors. If you look closely at the aileron control systems on these aircraft, you'll see the engineered solutions that Lockheed eventually developed. The hydraulic boosters. The strengthened structures. The proper fixes. You won't see any safety wire. But somewhere, in a maintenance log from 1943, in a squadron diary, in a faded photograph of mechanics working on a P-38 in the New Guinea jungle, the evidence remains. The stupid wire trick that changed everything. Charles Lindbergh died in 1974, at the age of 72. His obituaries focused on his Atlantic crossing, his famous flight, his controversial life. Few mentioned his wartime service. None mentioned the wire modification. But somewhere in those obituaries, there should have been a line. He also figured out how to make the P-38 Lightning turn with a zero, using nothing but a piece of wire. And that might have been just as important. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. It's not about airplanes or aerial combat or even World War II. It's about seeing problems differently. It's about having the courage to try simple solutions when everyone else is looking for complicated ones. It's about being willing to be called stupid. Because sometimes, the stupid solution is the smart one. The next time you're facing a seemingly insurmountable problem, the next time experts are telling you it requires years of work and millions of dollars to solve, the next time you're told that the proper solution is the only solution. Remember the P-38. Remember the wire. Remember that sometimes, the best engineering isn't about sophisticated solutions. It's about asking, what's the simplest thing that might work? And then having the courage to try it. The P-38 Lightning was a remarkable aircraft. It was fast, powerful, and deadly. But it needed help. And that help came from the most unlikely source, a piece of safety wire, twisted tight by a mechanic who refused to wait for the perfect solution. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's the story of how one mechanic's stupid wire trick made P-38s outmaneuver every zero and changed the course of the war.